The annual New Year's gathering at Daniel Whitaker's house had always been considered the most anticipated family event of the year. His home stood on a quiet tree-lined street outside Portland, a large modern house with tall windows and warm lights glowing inside. Every December 31st, relatives from all over the state gathered there to celebrate together. It was supposed to be a night of laughter, games, and tradition. This year was no different. Inside the house, music drifted through the rooms while guests chatted near the fireplace and children ran through the hallways with sparkling party hats. A long table in the dining room held trays of food, glasses of wine, and bowls of candy for the younger guests. Among the arriving relatives was Margaret Ellis, Daniel's mother. Margaret stepped into the foyer quietly, removing her wool coat while looking around the familiar house. She was 62 now, her gray hair neatly pinned back and her posture still proud despite the fatigue in her eyes. For years she had attended these gatherings with a polite smile, pretending not to notice the distance that had slowly grown between her and her son. At one time, Daniel had called her every day. Now weeks could pass without a word. Still, Margaret kept showing up. She told herself it was for the grandchildren. As she hung her coat near the staircase, her eyes drifted toward the corkboard on the wall. Daniel and his wife usually pinned announcements there, game rules, gift exchange lists, or notes about activities planned for the evening. A piece of paper had been pinned there already. Margaret stepped closer. At the top it read, New Year's Gift Exchange Participants. The names were written in a neat column. Daniel and Melissa Whitaker, hosts. Uncle Howard and Aunt Diane. Cousin Peter and family. Lena and Mark Carter. Margaret's eyes moved down the page until she reached the last line. She froze. Instead of simply writing her name, someone had added a comment beside it. Margaret, the bitter old guest. For a moment, she thought she had misread it. She leaned closer.
No.
The words were very clear.
The bitter old guest.
Her chest tightened as if the air had suddenly grown heavy. Behind her the house buzzed with conversation and laughter, but the sound now seemed distant, like noise coming from another building. Margaret read the line again, hoping it would somehow change. It didn't. Grandma. A small hand tugged gently at her sleeve. Margaret looked down to see Noah, her 8-year-old grandson, staring up at her with excitement. Come see my new drone, he said eagerly. Dad got it for me for Christmas. Margaret forced a smile, smoothing her expression before he could notice anything wrong. In a minute, sweetheart, she said softly. Grandma just needs to check something first. The boy nodded and ran off toward the living room. Margaret slowly removed the paper from the corkboard and folded it carefully. Her hands trembled slightly as she slipped it into her purse. Across the room, she spotted Melissa, Daniel's wife. Melissa stood near the kitchen island speaking with several guests, laughing as she described something about a recent vacation. She looked elegant in a navy evening dress, her dark hair falling perfectly across her shoulders. People often said Melissa had a natural charisma that filled any room. Margaret had once admired that quality. Over the years, however, admiration had slowly turned into something else, something colder. Margaret walked toward her. Melissa noticed her almost immediately. Margaret, she said with a pleasant smile that never quite reached her eyes. You made it. Daniel stood beside her, one arm resting lightly around Melissa's waist. He glanced toward his mother. Hey, Mom. The greeting sounded polite but distracted. Margaret had grown used to that tone. I need to speak with both of you, she said quietly. Melissa tilted her head slightly. Right now? Yes. Daniel sighed. Mom, the party just started. It won't take long, Margaret replied calmly. There was something in her voice that made Daniel pause. After a moment, he nodded.
All right.
Let's step into the study. They walked down the hallway toward Daniel's home office, while the noise of the party continued behind them. Once inside, Daniel closed the door. Margaret placed the folded paper on his desk. Would you mind reading the last line? She said. Daniel unfolded it. At first he seemed confused. Then his expression changed. He looked up slowly. Melissa, did you write this? Melissa glanced at the paper briefly and shrugged. It was a joke. A joke. Margaret repeated. Melissa crossed her arms. Oh, come on, Margaret. Don't make it into a drama. No one even noticed. Margaret stared at her. I noticed. Daniel rubbed his forehead. Melissa, maybe that wasn't the best idea. It was harmless, Melissa replied quickly. Everyone knows she's sensitive. Margaret felt something deep inside her tighten. For years she had ignored the small remarks, the sarcastic comments, the invitations that somehow never reached her. She had convinced herself they were misunderstandings. But this had been written for everyone to see.
Public.
Intentional. Daniel looked uncomfortable. Mom, I'm sure Melissa didn't mean anything serious. Margaret turned to him slowly. You knew about this? His silence answered the question. Melissa rolled her eyes. For heaven's sake, Margaret, it's New Year's Eve. Can we not ruin the evening? Margaret felt 30 years of restraint begin to crack. I have endured your disrespect for years, she said calmly, her voice steady despite the anger rising in her chest. But humiliating me in front of the entire family crosses a line. Melissa laughed softly. You're exaggerating. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Mom, maybe we should talk about this later. No, Margaret said firmly. She looked directly at her son. Do you remember what life was like after your father died? Daniel blinked in surprise. I worked double shifts, Margaret continued. I sold my car so you could stay in the same school. I spent nights cleaning offices after my hospital job just to pay for your books. Melissa sighed dramatically. Here comes the guilt speech. Daniel glanced at her. Melissa, stop. Margaret's voice softened slightly. I did all of that because I loved you more than anything in the world. Daniel looked down at the paper again. The room fell silent. Margaret picked up her purse. I think it's time I went home. Daniel looked up quickly. Mom, the party's not even halfway over. That's all right, she replied. Melissa leaned against the desk. She'll be back next week, she said casually. Where else would she go? Margaret paused at the door. For the first time that evening, she allowed herself a faint smile. You might be surprised, she said quietly. Then she walked out. The drive home that night felt endless. Streetlights passed across the windshield in a steady rhythm while Margaret's thoughts raced faster than the car itself. For 30 years, she had carried a secret, a truth she had promised never to reveal. But tonight something had changed. The insult on that list had broken the last fragile thread holding the past in silence. When she finally reached her small apartment across town, Margaret stepped inside and locked the door behind her. The quiet felt heavy. She walked to the bookshelf and pulled out an old photo album she rarely opened anymore. The first photograph showed a young woman holding a newborn baby. Margaret stared at the picture for a long time. Then she whispered softly into the empty room. It's time. Because the truth Daniel believed about his life was not the truth at all. And soon he was going to learn everything. The next morning arrived quietly, but Margaret Ellis felt as if the entire world had shifted during the night. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, the same thoughts returned. The paper on the corkboard, Melissa's dismissive voice, Daniel's hesitation. For years she had tolerated small humiliations for the sake of peace, convincing herself that patience would eventually heal the distance between her and her son. But something inside her had finally broken. As pale winter sunlight crept through the curtains of her small apartment in Portland, Margaret sat at the kitchen table staring into a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Her apartment was modest but tidy. The furniture was old but carefully maintained, and the shelves were filled with books and framed photographs. Many of those photographs showed Daniel at different stages of his life. A smiling toddler holding a toy truck, a boy in a Little League uniform, a teenager proudly holding his high school diploma. Each picture carried a memory Margaret had guarded for decades. Yet there was one photograph she had never displayed. It remained hidden in a box inside her bedroom closet. Margaret glanced toward the hallway that led to her bedroom. The box was still there, waiting. It had followed her through 3 apartments and 2 decades of moves. She had never opened it casually. Whenever she touched it, the weight of the past returned all at once. But today would be different. At exactly 1:10 in the afternoon, her doorbell rang. Margaret stood slowly and walked toward the door. She already knew who it would be. Daniel stood in the hallway outside, his coat unbuttoned and his expression tired. The lines around his eyes looked deeper than usual.
"Hi," he said.
Margaret stepped aside to let him enter. "Hello, Daniel." The formality between them felt strange, but neither mentioned it. He walked into the living room and looked around briefly, as if noticing the apartment for the first time in years. Margaret closed the door behind him. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "I can't stay long. Melissa has a planning meeting this afternoon." Margaret nodded quietly. "Of course she does." They sat across from each other in the living room. Daniel rested his elbows on his knees and rubbed his hands together. "Look," he said after a moment, "about last night things got a little out of control." Margaret watched him carefully. "Did they?" Daniel sighed. "Melissa shouldn't have written that comment. I told her it was unnecessary." "But you still allowed it," Margaret replied calmly. Daniel didn't respond. Instead, he changed the subject. "You said there was something important you wanted to tell me." Margaret studied her son's face. The same brown eyes she had watched grow from childhood to adulthood looked back at her now, impatient but curious. "Yes," she said. She stood up and walked toward the hallway. "I need to show you something first." Daniel frowned but followed her with his eyes as she disappeared into the bedroom. A few moments later, she returned carrying a worn cardboard box. She placed it gently on the coffee table between them. Daniel looked at it with confusion. "What's this?" Margaret sat down again. "Something I should have shown you a long time ago." She opened the box slowly. Inside were neatly arranged documents, envelopes, and photographs. The papers had yellowed with age. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "What is all this?" Margaret picked up the top document and handed it to him. It was a birth certificate. Daniel studied it for a few seconds, then frowned. "This is my birth certificate," he said. Margaret nodded. "But the mother listed here." Daniel paused. His eyes narrowed. "This says Elena Carter." Margaret folded her hands together. "Yes." Daniel looked up sharply. "That's impossible. Elena Carter was Dad's assistant years ago." "She was more than that," Margaret said quietly. Daniel stared at her. "What are you talking about?" Margaret took a deep breath. The moment she had avoided for 30 years had finally arrived. "Daniel," she said gently, "Elena Carter was also my younger sister." The words seemed to hang in the air like a sudden thunderclap. Daniel blinked in disbelief. "No," he said immediately. "That's not possible." Margaret didn't interrupt him. "You're my mother," he continued. "I grew up with you. I remember everything." "Yes," Margaret said softly. "You grew up with me." Daniel stood up and began pacing the room. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "Why are you telling me this now?" Margaret watched him quietly. "After your father died," she explained, "I was going through his office. I found letters locked in a drawer. Letters from Elena." Daniel stopped pacing. "What letters?" Margaret reached into the box and pulled out a small bundle of envelopes tied together with faded ribbon. "She and your father had been having an affair," Margaret said. Daniel shook his head.
"No."
"She became pregnant with you." "That's not true." "Daniel." "Stop," he said sharply. Margaret fell silent. Daniel grabbed another document from the box. It was a hospital record showing Elena Carter listed as the patient during Daniel's birth. His hands trembled slightly. "She died in a car accident when you were 3 months old," Margaret continued quietly. "Your father came to me after the funeral. He told me everything." Daniel's breathing became uneven. "And you just took me?" he asked. "I raised you," Margaret said. Daniel laughed bitterly. "You're saying my entire life has been a lie?"
"No." Margaret replied firmly.
Your life was real. Every moment we shared was real. Daniel looked around the apartment, as if seeing it differently. All those years, he whispered. You were never a burden, Margaret said gently. When your father placed you in my arms that night, you were just a baby who needed someone to love him. Daniel picked up one of the photographs from the box. It showed a young woman holding a newborn child. The resemblance between the woman and Daniel was unmistakable. That's Elena, Margaret said quietly. Daniel stared at the photo. She has my eyes. Margaret nodded. Yes. Daniel slowly lowered the photograph. Why didn't you tell me before? Margaret looked down at her hands. Your father made me promise to keep it secret. He believed the truth would only hurt you. Daniel's jaw tightened. So, instead you both lied to me for 30 years. Margaret felt the sting of those words, but did not argue. I was afraid, she admitted. Afraid you would stop seeing me as your mother. Daniel turned away. I don't even know what to think right now. Margaret watched him carefully. Take the box with you, she said. Daniel looked back at her. What? You deserve to know your own history. He hesitated before picking up the box. His voice was quieter now. Does Melissa know about this?
No.
Daniel nodded slowly. I need time, he said. Margaret's chest tightened. I understand. Daniel walked toward the door, but paused before leaving. You should have told me sooner. I know, Margaret replied softly. He opened the door and stepped out into the hallway. For a moment it seemed like he might say something else. But instead he left without another word. Margaret closed the door and leaned against it, exhausted. The secret she had carried for 3 decades was finally out in the open. And now everything that came next was completely uncertain. 3 days passed without a single word from Daniel. Margaret tried not to count the hours, but it was impossible. Each morning she woke up hoping her phone would show a missed call or a message. Each evening she went to bed wondering if revealing the truth had been the worst mistake of her life. The silence weighed heavily on her. She continued with her routine as best she could. On Tuesdays she volunteered at the public library, helping visitors find books and organizing return materials. On Wednesdays she attended her book club, where the group discussed a historical novel she had barely managed to read. The conversations around her felt distant, as though she were watching the world through a thick pane of glass. Her friend Carol noticed first. You seem distracted, Carol said gently while they washed coffee cups after the meeting. Margaret forced a small smile. Just family things. Carol nodded knowingly. She had 2 adult children herself and understood how complicated those relationships could become. They come around eventually, she said. Sometimes people just need time. Margaret hoped she was right. Still, each evening when she returned to her apartment, the quiet felt heavier than the day before. On Thursday night, as she was heating soup on the stove, the doorbell rang.
Her heart jumped.
For a brief, hopeful moment she believed it might be Daniel. But when she opened the door, she saw Melissa standing in the hallway. Melissa's expression was cold and controlled, though her eyes burned with anger. May I come in? She asked sharply. Before Margaret could answer, Melissa stepped inside. Margaret closed the door slowly behind her. Good evening, Melissa. Let's skip the pleasantries, Melissa replied. She removed her gloves and tossed them onto the kitchen counter. What exactly did you say to Daniel? Margaret remained calm. Would you like some tea? Melissa's voice rose immediately. I didn't come here for tea. I came for answers. Margaret turned off the stove and faced her. I told Daniel the truth about his birth. Melissa frowned. What does that even mean? Margaret studied her for a moment before speaking. It means I told him that I'm not his biological mother. Melissa stared at her. For a moment, she seemed genuinely confused. That's ridiculous, she said finally. Of course you're his mother. Margaret shook her head slowly.
No.
I raised him, but he was born to my sister. Melissa blinked. Your sister? Yes. Margaret explained briefly about Elena, about the affair, and about the accident that had taken Elena's life when Daniel was still an infant. Melissa sank into one of the kitchen chairs, clearly stunned. "That's what he's been looking at," she murmured. "That box of documents." Margaret said nothing. Melissa rubbed her temples. "You waited 30 years to tell him this?" "Yes." "And you decided New Year's Eve weekend was the perfect time?" Margaret's voice remained steady. "He deserved to know the truth." Melissa's expression hardened again.
No.
What he deserved was stability. Margaret felt a flicker of irritation. "You believe lies provide stability." Melissa stood up abruptly. "You destroy his entire sense of identity," she said angrily. "Do you realize that?" Margaret met her gaze. "I carried that secret for 3 decades. Every day I wondered when the truth would finally come out." Melissa laughed bitterly. "This is unbelievable. All these years you played the perfect devoted mother, and now suddenly you decide to drop a bomb on his life." Margaret's patience began to thin. "I never pretended to be perfect." Melissa crossed her arms. "No, you just pretended to be a victim." The accusation hung heavily in the room. Margaret felt the old, familiar frustration rising again. "For years you have treated me like an inconvenience," she said calmly. "You've excluded me from birthdays, school events, and holidays. And Daniel believed every excuse you gave him." Melissa scoffed. "That's absurd." "Is it?" Margaret stepped closer. "How many times did you tell him I was busy when I wasn't invited?" Melissa's expression flickered briefly. "That's not. How many times did you schedule visits when he was at work so I couldn't see my own son?" Melissa opened her mouth to respond, but stopped. Margaret's voice softened. "I tolerated it because I didn't want conflict." Melissa shook her head. "You're rewriting history." Before Margaret could reply, the front door opened. Both women turned. Daniel stood in the doorway. He looked exhausted. His eyes moved slowly between his wife and Margaret. "What's going on?" he asked. Melissa straightened immediately. "I came to check on you," she said quickly. "You've barely spoken in 3 days." Daniel stepped inside and closed the door. "You went through my things," he said quietly. Melissa froze. "What?" "The box," Daniel continued. "You opened it while I was at work." Melissa hesitated. "I was worried." Daniel's expression hardened. "You read the letters." "They were sitting right there." Daniel's voice was colder now. "Did you also read the messages on my phone?" Melissa's eyes widened. "What messages?" Daniel pulled out his phone. "The ones between you and your sister." Margaret watched silently as Melissa's confidence began to crumble. Daniel read aloud from the screen. "I swear his mother is so dramatic. If I keep scheduling things carefully, she barely sees the kids anymore." Melissa's face turned pale. "Daniel, that was just venting." Daniel scrolled down. "It's easier when he believes she's too busy to come." Melissa looked desperate now. "You're taking those out of context." Daniel looked at her with disbelief. "For 6 years, I believed you when you said Mom couldn't make it to events." Melissa's voice trembled. "She's difficult sometimes." Daniel turned to Margaret. "You were never even told about Ethan's school play, were you?" Margaret shook her head gently.
No.
Daniel's jaw tightened. "I thought you just didn't want to come." Silence filled the apartment. Melissa tried again. "Daniel, we can talk about this privately." "No," he said firmly. He turned toward the door again. "I need space." Melissa's voice rose. "You're leaving?" "For tonight." "Daniel." "Not tonight," he repeated. He looked at Margaret briefly. "I'll call you when I'm ready." Margaret nodded quietly. Melissa stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen as Daniel walked out. A moment later the door closed behind him. The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. Melissa grabbed her coat. "This isn't over," she said sharply. Then she stormed out. Margaret remained standing alone in the kitchen. For a long time, she simply listened to the quiet apartment. She had feared that telling the truth would destroy everything. But now she realized something else entirely. The truth had only revealed what had already been broken. The weeks that followed were some of the quietest Margaret Ellis had experienced in years. Winter settled heavily over Portland, bringing gray skies, cold rain, and long evenings that seemed to stretch endlessly. After the confrontation in her apartment, Daniel disappeared from her life once again, but this time the silence felt different. It wasn't just distance, it was the slow, uncertain pause of someone trying to understand a reality that had shifted beneath his feet. Margaret tried not to imagine what he was going through. Still, she couldn't stop wondering. Every morning she woke early and made tea while looking out the kitchen window at the quiet street below. Sometimes she caught herself staring at her phone, hoping it would ring. Other times she deliberately placed it across the room so she wouldn't obsess over it. Her life continued in small routines. She spent hours at the library helping children find books and assisting elderly visitors with computer searches. She attended book club meetings, took evening walks when the rain paused, and occasionally met Carol for coffee. Yet there was always a sense that something important was missing. Daniel. She wondered whether he was angry, confused, or simply overwhelmed. She imagined him sitting alone at his office desk late at night, reading the letters from Elena again and again. She imagined him studying the old photographs, noticing similarities he had never seen before. Sometimes Margaret worried that revealing the truth had pushed him too far away, but there was no way to undo it now. One afternoon in late February, while she was sorting returned books at the library desk, Carol approached quietly. "You're somewhere else again," Carol observed gently. Margaret sighed. "Family matters." Carol leaned against the counter. "Still no contact?" Margaret shook her head. "Not yet." Carol gave her a sympathetic look. "My daughter didn't speak to me for nearly 5 months after her divorce. I thought our relationship was ruined forever." "What happened?" Margaret asked. She eventually realized she needed someone who loved her unconditionally, Carol said with a soft smile. "Family usually finds its way back together. It just takes time." Margaret nodded politely, though she wasn't sure whether the same would be true for her situation. That evening she returned home feeling unusually tired. The sky was dark and rain tapped steadily against her windows. She was just beginning to prepare dinner when the doorbell rang. Her heart skipped. She walked slowly toward the door and opened it. Daniel stood there, soaked from the rain. His hair was damp, and his coat clung to his shoulders. He looked exhausted but calmer than the last time she had seen him. "Hi," he said quietly. Margaret stepped aside immediately. "Come in before you freeze." Daniel entered the apartment and removed his coat. Water dripped onto the floor as he hung it near the door. "I didn't call first," he said. "That's all right." Margaret handed him a towel. "Dry off." Daniel wiped his face and sat down in the living room chair he had used during their last conversation. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Daniel looked up. "I've spent the last few weeks doing a lot of thinking," he said. Margaret waited silently. "I contacted some people who knew Elena," he continued. Margaret's heart tightened. "And?" Daniel leaned back slightly. "They confirmed everything you told me." Margaret nodded slowly. Daniel stared at the carpet for a moment before speaking again. "I also found her parents." Margaret looked surprised. "The Carters?" "Yes," Daniel said. "They live in Arizona now." "Did you speak with them?" Daniel shook his head. "Not yet." He paused before adding quietly, "I wanted to talk to you first." Margaret felt a small wave of relief wash over her. She sat across from him. "How have you been?" she asked gently. Daniel hesitated, confused. He gave a tired laugh. "That's probably the best word." Margaret understood. "I'm still angry about the secret," Daniel admitted. "I won't pretend otherwise." "You have every right to be," Margaret said. "But I've also been thinking about everything you did for me growing up," he continued. Margaret said nothing. Daniel glanced around the apartment. "You worked 2 jobs when I was a kid. I remember waking up some mornings and finding you asleep at the kitchen table." Margaret smiled faintly. "I was never very good at hiding my exhaustion." Daniel continued. You taught me how to ride a bike. You stayed up late helping me study for exams. You never missed one of my soccer games. Margaret's eyes softened. Those were my favorite days. Daniel leaned forward slightly. That's what I keep coming back to. All those moments were real. Yes, Margaret said quietly. They were. Daniel studied her face carefully.
You didn't have to do any of that, he said.
I wanted to. You could have walked away after Dad told you the truth. Margaret shook her head. You were just a baby. None of it was your fault. Daniel looked down at his hands. That's what I'm starting to realize. He paused before speaking again. There's something else. Margaret felt a small tension return. What is it? Daniel hesitated. Melissa and I are separating. Margaret blinked in surprise. I'm sorry, she said softly. Daniel shrugged. We've had problems for a long time. I just refused to see them. Margaret remained silent. After everything that happened, Daniel continued, I started noticing things I ignored before.
The way she spoke about you.
The way she managed family plans. He shook his head. I should have paid attention sooner. Margaret chose her words carefully. I never wanted to come between you. I know, Daniel said quickly. That's the thing. You never tried to. The rain continued tapping against the windows as silence settled between them again. Finally, Daniel spoke once more. I'm still figuring things out, he said. My life suddenly looks very different than it did a month ago. That's understandable. Daniel stood up slowly. But one thing is clear, he said. Margaret looked up. You raised me, Daniel continued. Biology doesn't change that. Margaret felt emotion rise in her chest. You're my son, she whispered. Daniel nodded. I think I'm starting to understand that. He walked toward the door and picked up his coat. Before leaving, he paused. The kids ask about you, he said. Margaret's eyes widened slightly. They do. Especially Noah. A small smile appeared on Margaret's face. I miss them. Daniel nodded. You'll see them soon. He opened the door. Good night, Mom. The word stopped Margaret for a moment.
Mom.
It had been a long time since she had heard him say it with warmth. Good night, Daniel, she replied softly. As the door closed behind him, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in many weeks. Hope. Because even though the truth had shaken everything, it had also started something new. And sometimes, beginnings came only after the hardest endings. Nearly a year passed after the night Margaret Ellis revealed the truth that had been hidden for 3 decades. In that time, life slowly rearranged itself into something neither she nor Daniel had expected. The first few months had been uncertain. Daniel and Melissa's separation quickly became official, and their marriage ended with a quiet but difficult divorce. The process had not been easy. Lawyers, paperwork, and tense conversations filled many weeks. At times, Daniel seemed exhausted by the entire situation, but he remained determined to rebuild his life with honesty instead of silence. The custody arrangement for the children eventually settled into a routine. Noah and his younger sister Lily spent the school year mostly with Daniel, while part of their summer vacations were spent visiting Melissa in Chicago, where she had moved for a new job. Though the situation wasn't perfect, it created a new rhythm that allowed Daniel to focus on being present in his children's lives. Margaret also found herself becoming a larger part of that rhythm. At first, the visits were small and cautious. Daniel would stop by with the children for a short afternoon visit or invite Margaret over for dinner once every couple of weeks. But as time passed, those visits became more natural. The tension that had once surrounded their conversations gradually disappeared. One warm summer evening, Margaret stood in her kitchen arranging freshly baked cookies on a large plate. The smell of chocolate filled the room, and sunlight streamed through the window above the sink. At the small table near the window, Lily sat surrounded by colored pencils, glitter glue, and construction paper. "Grandma," Lily asked, carefully cutting out a heart shape, "do you think Dad will like this birthday card?" Margaret leaned over to look. The card was covered in bright colors and uneven shapes, but in the center Lily had drawn a stick-figure family. "I think he'll love it," Margaret said warmly. Lily pointed proudly at each drawing. "That's Dad, and that's Noah, and that's me. And that's you, Grandma." Margaret smiled. "I'm honored to be included." From the living room came the sound of laughter. Daniel and Noah were arguing playfully about the rules of a board game they had been setting up on the coffee table. "You can't move that piece yet," Noah protested. "I absolutely can," Daniel replied. "No, you skipped your turn." Their voices carried easily through the apartment, filling the space with a warmth Margaret had once feared she might never feel again. A moment later, Noah ran into the kitchen. "Grandma, can I try one of the cookies?" Margaret raised an eyebrow. "They're supposed to be for your dad's birthday cake." Noah gave her his most convincing smile. "Just one?" Margaret laughed and handed him a cookie anyway. Only because chefs deserve to test their creations. Noah grinned and ran back to the living room. Daniel appeared in the doorway a moment later. "Are you spoiling him again?" he asked with a smile. "Of course," Margaret replied. "That's part of a grandmother's job." Daniel leaned against the doorframe, watching the scene quietly for a moment. The past year had changed him. Some of the tension he used to carry had faded, replaced by something calmer. His relationship with Margaret had grown stronger than it had been in many years, built now on honesty rather than silent assumptions. "Need help with anything?" he asked. Margaret shook her head. "Everything's almost ready." Daniel stepped closer and stole a small piece of chocolate frosting from the bowl on the counter. Margaret lightly tapped his hand. "Hey," she protested. Daniel laughed. "Some traditions never change." For a moment they stood side by side in comfortable silence. Then Daniel cleared his throat slightly. "There's something I wanted to tell you," he said. Margaret looked at him carefully. "What is it?" Daniel hesitated before speaking. "A few months ago, I finally contacted Elena's parents." Margaret's hands stilled. "The Carters?" "Yes." Margaret took a slow breath. "How did that go?" Daniel's expression softened. "They're in their 80s now, but they're still sharp. We spoke on the phone first, then I visited them last month." Margaret listened quietly. "They told me stories about Elena," Daniel continued, "about what she was like growing up. She loved photography, apparently. She carried a camera everywhere." Margaret nodded. "That sounds like her." Daniel smiled faintly. "They showed me some of her photos. She was really talented." Margaret looked down for a moment, remembering her younger sister before everything had become complicated. "What did they say about me?" she asked quietly. Daniel placed a hand gently over hers. "They said they always wondered how you were doing." Margaret looked surprised. "Your father told them that after Elena died, you wanted distance so you could raise me without interference." Margaret sighed softly. "That sounds like Richard." "They respected that decision," Daniel continued. "But they always felt grateful that you raised me." Margaret blinked back sudden emotion. "They said that?" Daniel nodded. "And they want to meet you." Margaret looked up in surprise. "Me?" "Yes." Daniel smiled gently. "They consider you part of the family." Margaret sat quietly for a moment, absorbing the idea. Years ago, the thought of meeting Elena's parents again would have filled her with anxiety and pain. But now something inside her felt calmer, stronger. "I think I would like that," she said finally. Daniel nodded. "I hoped you would." From the living room, Noah called loudly.
"Dad."
"Are we playing or not?" Daniel laughed. "Coming." Margaret carried the plate of cookies and the small birthday cake into the living room. Lily followed behind her, proudly holding the handmade card. The four of them gathered around the coffee table while Daniel lit the candles. "Make a wish," Lily said excitedly. Daniel looked around the room before blowing them out. His gaze lingered briefly on Margaret. For years their relationship had been strained by silence and misunderstandings. Now, after everything had been revealed, they had somehow found their way back to each other. The candles flickered as Daniel leaned forward and blew them out. Everyone clapped. Later that evening, after the children had gone home with Daniel and the apartment had grown quiet again, Margaret sat alone by the window. She picked up a photograph from the bedside table. It was an old picture of Elena. For many years, Margaret had kept it hidden away because looking at it had been too painful. But now the photo stood openly on the table beside her bed. Margaret studied her sister's smiling face. "He turned out well," she whispered softly. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the night sky. Margaret placed the photograph back on the table and turned off the lamp. For the first time in many years, she felt completely at peace. Because the truth she had once feared would destroy everything had instead done something unexpected. It had cleared away the silence. It had revealed what truly mattered. And in the end, it had reminded them all that family was not defined only by blood. Sometimes it was defined by the people who chose to stay.